Hey everyone, welcome back to English 112 here at Delta College. This is week 15, so this will be the final lesson for this semester. Today we're going to be talking about quoting and citing, and that's information that you need for revising your proposals. So let's go ahead and get started. So, first of all, remember back when we talked about word errors that a common grammatical error, is quote versus quotation. Quote is a verb, whereas quotation is a noun. They're not supposed to be used interchangeably. So when you quote, you are performing an action, and what you are quoting is a quotation. So when you use the words of someone else, word for word, then that is a quotation. You are quoting others. There is a difference between quoting and paraphrasing, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. But generally speaking, quoting is when you use someone's ideas expressed the way that that person expresses them. So, in the words of that person, of that source. Whereas a paraphrase is when you change the way the idea is expressed and express it the way that you do. So, why use quotations? For our purposes and for most academic writing, there are two reasons rather why we quote, which is evidence and authority. So when we want to show evidence or proof of what we're talking about, we will use the quotations to show that we're not just making something up. We also use it as a form of authority, as that rhetorical strategy, as we've talked about before. If you do not have recognized expertise in the subject which you're discussing, you can import that expertise through the use of using quotations from experts and using their authority to show that, hey, you've done your homework. Quotation is also used for dialogue. So if you ever read a work of fiction, for example, and you have two characters speaking to each other, that dialogue is expressed through quotations. We also use quotation for the purpose of analysis. So let's say you want to really take apart someone's idea, you can use the quotation and then break it down into its parts, its words, its punctuation, whatever, in order to examine the idea more closely. And that's very common if you're writing like a literary analysis where you have to analyze a poem or a short story. You would use the quotation and then break it down into its parts in order to find the deeper meaning of that text. And then often quotations are used as epigraphs. An epigraph is when, let's say, you start a book or an essay and you see a quotation at the very beginning that's separated from the rest of the text. That is an epigraph. That's when someone is using this phrase that they feel is thematically important to their own work. And so it helps to set up or create a sense of theme for the work. So those forms of quotation are more decorative than anything else, and you don't see them too often in academic writing, although you can use quotation for that purpose. So again, quotations versus paraphrases. A quotation is using someone's words exactly as they use them, whereas the paraphrase is where you change the idiom, the manner in which the idea is expressed, and express it the way that you would express the idea. So it's in your own words, but that doesn't mean just changing a few words here or there. It means changing the way the idea is expressed. So, for example, I'm using our handbook, Andrea Lunsford's Easy Writer, and when she writes about quotation, she says, as Lunsford states, use an author's exact words when the wording is so memorable or expresses a point so well that you cannot improve or shorten it without weakening it. So in that case, that is her exact words. So that's why it's being expressed as a quotation. Now, to paraphrase that, as Lunsford states, quotation should only be used when the original text says something better than you can. In that case, I'm expressing the same idea that she expresses, but I'm not using her exact words. I'm expressing the idea the way that I would express it. So that's a paraphrase. Why should you use a quotation versus a paraphrase? Well, as Lunsford, says, you should only use a quotation if the idea is expressed in a way that's better than you could express it. You should focus on paraphrasing instead, focusing on your own words or expressing the ideas in your own way. And the advantage of doing that is it shows that you have internalized the information or the source material and that you understand it and comprehend it. And in academic writing, there is the focus on that idea that you are interpreting information or that you are internalizing the data or the ideas and the concepts, that you have mastered them. So there's a much greater emphasis on paraphrasing in academic writing than there is on quotation. Although quotations, like I said, are used for multiple purposes, you can use them as evidence, analysis, or authority. So quotations help create what we call the personal interest factor, or the PIF. As I talked about back when I looked at revising introductions, readers like quotations. It appeals to them because it creates that personal interest factor. It makes them feel as if they're being participating or asked to participate in a conversation or a dialogue. And also, it creates visual interest by breaking up the blockiness of the text by using the quotation marks, by using that punctuation. And so you'll see that for texts that are meant to inform general audiences, so newspaper articles or magazine articles, for example, they will use a large degree of quotations, typically about 70%. That means that 70% of the text is in the form of quotation. So it has a 70% PIF. Texts that are meant to persuade instead and persuade specific audiences, so let's say academic writing, for example, have a much lower degree of quotations being used, typically 30% or less. So 30% or less of the text is in the form of quotation. So there's a much greater emphasis on original ideas or ideas being expressed in your own voice. So how to quote? There are three basic, well, let's say three and a half basic steps you have to take. You have to introduce the quotation in some way. So you can't just drop a quotation into your text and let it stand on its own. You have to set it up. You have to introduce it. Lunsford refers to this as a signal phrase. So when you say something like, according to Lunsford, that is a signal phrase that is being used to introduce the quotation. So once you've set it up, once you've introduced it, then you execute, which means you actually use the quotation and you cite it. And it's always important to cite whenever you use an idea from another source. So not just a quotation, but for a paraphrase as well. So in this case, use an author's exact words when the wording is so memorable or expresses a point so well that you cannot improve or shorten it without weakening it. So in this case, I'm using her exact words. So it is a direct quotation. And I'm citing it. That comes from page 88 of her book. And then once you've done that, you have to explicate the quotation in some way. You have to explain either what the quotation means or make it clear why you are using the quotation. You have to make an explicit connection to your text. Like I said, you can't just let the quotation stand on its own. You have to do something with it. You have to explain why it's there. So what she means is that it is more important to focus on your own ideas and words and only quote when it is necessary. So in that case, I'm explaining what she means in her quotation. So when you quote, you have to do those 3 to 3.5 things. You have to introduce, you have to execute and cite, and then explicate. Block quotations. You've probably seen a text where you have a long quotation that is set off from the rest of the text. That's called a block quotation. And you would only use block quotations for long quotations, and defining what makes it long depends on the format that you're using. And I'll discuss different formats a little bit later. So for quotations that run 4 lines or longer in MLA format, then you would set it off in the rest of your text as a block quotation. In APA format, then that means it's longer than 40 words. And to set it off in the rest of your quotation, you would double indent from the left margin. So if a normal indentation is 5 spaces or 1 tab, if you're using the tab key, then the double indentation would be 2 tabs or 10 spaces. So you would double indent it from the left margin, and you don't use quotation marks. And the reason for that is the indentation tells your reader that that passage is a quotation. So you don't have to use the quotation marks. So for example, Lunsford states, use an author's exact words when the wording is so memorable or expresses at a point so well, and so forth. Now, if this is 4 lines or longer, then I would use that the block quotation form and double indent it from the left margin. Generally speaking, you should avoid using block quotations. Again, you should be focusing on expressing ideas in your own voice. So if you have something, a long quotation, it's better to paraphrase it than to use a block quotation, and only use the block quotation if you have to. And so we come to citing, and citing can be a little confusing. You have to cite whenever you use an idea or information from another source, whether it's a quotation or a paraphrase. And there are various formats that we can use for citing. And the reason for this is different disciplines have different formats because they focus on different ideas. So in the humanities, which includes language and literature, art and music, and philosophy, we use MLA format. MLA is the Modern Language Association. And because the humanities focus on creativity, the focus of MLA citations is on ownership of ideas. So you need to identify who the owner of that information is and where you found it. So MLA citations emphasize giving authors' names and page numbers. So in this case, Lunsford 88, for example. In that case, the citation identifies the owner, the author, by last name, and the location of that idea, page 88. So for an in-text citation in MLA format, you would use a parenthetical, and you would put the author's last name and page number within the parentheses. And you only include the information that you have. So if you're using a source where there is no listed author, then you would use the title of that article instead and put that in quotation marks within the parentheses along with the page number. Or if you don't have a page number, let's say you're using the internet as a source, then you would omit the number and just put the author's last name or title if you don't know who the author is. The idea is that it needs to correspond to the works cited page so that the reader can go from your in-text citation and find the full citation on the citation page immediately. So whatever you use to begin the citation on the citation page, that's what goes in the parentheses. So in MLA, the citation page is called works cited, or work cited if you're only citing one source. And you only list those sources that you actually cite in your essay. So if you look at other sources, but you don't actually use them, you don't have to list them. You only cite the works or you only list the works that are cited in your paper. And the works cited page is double spaced. So like the rest of your manuscript, it's double spaced. And the entries are listed in alphabetical order, and you use hanging indentation. Hanging indentation is when you indent the second and subsequent lines. So you would indent them from the left margin. When you indent the first line, that's called a paragraph indentation. You use that in your essay, but for the citations on the works cited page, it's hanging indentation. And you do that because if the page is double spaced, then the hanging indentation separates the entries on the works cited page so they don't all run together. So for example, citing Lunsford's book, this is how you would do it in MLA format. You would put the author's name, last name first, title of the book, along with edition number if there is one, along with the publisher's name and the date of publication. And that's the basic format for MLA. So whichever type of source that you're using, whether it be a periodical, an article, a video, or a website, that's the basic format that you use: author, title, publisher, date. And then you can just include the information that you need to for whatever your source is according to that pattern. And by the way, if you have questions about how to cite a certain source, use the handbook, because there is a section in the handbook which shows you exactly how to cite sources and different types of sources in these different formats that we're going to be talking about. Okay, APA, or American Psychological Association, is used primarily in the physical sciences. So you're looking at biology, the healthcare fields, medicine, anatomy, psychology, obviously. Those fields that deal with sort of lab work primarily, or observation. Now, you would not use APA in the case of chemistry or physics. Technically, they have their own format, which is called CSE, which stands for Council of Science Editors. But for the rest of the physical sciences, you would use APA format. And in those fields, you don't deal with creativity. You deal with data and statistics. And so what they emphasize is the currency of the information. So you still include author's name, although that's not as important. What is important is that you focus on the date. So in those citations, you put the date. So according to Lunsford, 2016, for example. So the date always follows the name of the source, either the author's name, or if you don't know the author, then the title of that research study. So the date always follows the source. You would only include a page number if it's a direct quotation. So in this case, I use that sample quotation of use an author's exact words when the wording is so memorable and so forth. So you would only include the page number if it's a direct quotation. If it's a paraphrase, then you don't include a page number. So in APA format, you might end up using 2 citations for your source. So again, you cite the dates immediately after the source's name. And then if you're using a direct quotation, then you use a page number. And here's where it gets a little confusing in APA format. The page in which you list your sources at the end of the paper, APA has 2 different types. There's the reference page, and then there's a bibliography page. So a reference page is where you list all of those sources that you refer to in your essay, similar to a works cited. And then the bibliography page is where you list all the sources that you looked at or consulted in your research, whether you actually use them in your paper or not. So you will always have to include a reference page in APA format. Sometimes you'll have to include an additional bibliography. So just be aware of that. Like MLA, the reference page is going to be double-spaced, alphabetical order, hanging indentation. The difference here is the date immediately follows the author's name or the title if you don't know who the author is. So again, they're focusing on the currency of the data. So here's a sample entry in APA formats for Easy Writer. So you use the author's name, last name first, and note that the first initial is used. They do not use first names in APA format. So first initial, followed by the date, and then the title, and then the publisher. Although in this case, you are required to use the place of publication in addition to the publisher's name. And that's the basic form for APA references. Again, that's the basic pattern. And if you need to cite a different type of source, a web page, for example, you would follow the same basic pattern and just include the information that you need according to that pattern. And again, if you have any questions about citing a specific source, look to the handbook. And then the other big format that college students deal with is CMS, which is Chicago Manual of Style. That's used primarily in the social sciences. So if you're looking at history, political science, sociology, geography, economics, these are social sciences, and they use CMS. And the focus of CMS is to present the information in an unobtrusive way, because you don't want to disrupt the reader's train of thought by forcing them to look at a citation. So instead, they use footnotes or endnotes. So you would use your source, your quotation, or your paraphrase, and you would put a superscript number after it. And that number corresponds to a note at the bottom of the page or at the end of the paper. Typically, you use one or the other, either footnotes or endnotes. You don't use both. And for the most part, you use footnotes, or that's the primary form of note that you use. And it's in the notes that you give the full citation information. So author's name, title, publication information, and then that's where you would include the page number. Now, if you're using the same source for multiple references, if you're using the same source more than once, then you don't have to include the full citation information in each note. So you can get away with using the abbreviation IBID, which comes from the Latin ibidem, meaning in the same place. Here's kind of a trick question. Which format are you going to use in your proposal essay? I say it's kind of a trick question because it's going to be determined by your audience. Even though this is an English class in which we use MLA formats, and that's what we've been using for all of the previous papers in here, for the proposal, you want to focus on who your audience is. And so you want to use the format that's appropriate for your audience. So if you are directing your essay towards an audience of people in the humanities, then you would use MLA. If your audience are people in the physical sciences, then you need to use APA. And then if your audience are people in the social sciences, then you need to use CMS. Okay, finally, due dates. There's nothing due this week, but be aware that there are two things which are due next week. And those are the final draft of the proposal paper and the final exam. So those are both due on the last day of the semester. And make sure you check the syllabus for the specific dates and times, because the last day of the semester will vary depending on which semester it is. So be careful about that. So yeah, the final draft of the final paper is due on the last day, and so is the final exam. And the final exam is a little bit different from the midterm. It's still a timed essay, but in this case, you won't be writing a response to some text. Rather, you'll be formulating your own argument. So I will assign you a topic, and then you have to construct an argument about that topic. And you will have 3 hours to do that. And again, once you start the exam, you have to complete it within that 3 hour period in order for it to count. So don't start it unless you intend to finish it within 3 hours. And again, that's going to be due on the last day of the semester. Okay, that's it for this term. Well, just about. That's it for the instruction for this term. There's still an extra week to go here for you to complete your work. So go ahead and get started on that. Try to have fun with it, and good luck with it. So I hope you do well. Take it easy and take care.